chapter of Exodus, you've probably noticed a massive unexplained gap in the story. The book's opening includes a single ominous sentence. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." In what seems like an instant, the Hebrews go from being the protected elite of the Nile to being the slaves in the mud pits. The Bible presents it as a sudden shift in politics, but it never really explains the why. Why would a superpower like Egypt suddenly turn on a population that had lived there in peace for generations? Why did they go from being guests to being perceived as a national security threat? For most of history, the answer was simple enough. The new king over Egypt forgot about what Joseph had done, and he also harbored some hate in his heart for the Hebrew people. Or maybe there was some mixture of fear that such a large population would suddenly turn from peaceful to rebellious. That is also stated in Exodus 1. And so his response was to enslave them. The answer is missed in most Bible study lessons. It's buried in the dirt in the Nile Delta, in a story most people have never heard. It's a story of political hubris and power grabs, clever military maneuvers, and siege warfare. This story connects the betrayal of the Ephraimite tribe who attempted to escape the enslavement in Egypt to the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel. It's all part of this same narrative. In this story, you'll see that before there was a deliverer in Moses, there was a war in Avarice. And before there was an exodus of slaves, there was a defection of a tribe. We're about to dive into the volatile political and military drama that defined the rise of the 18th dynasty. But there's a massive piece of this puzzle that mainstream history prefers to avoid. If you've ever felt like there's a gap between the biblical story and the Egyptian records, a silence where there should be at least some chatter, you're right. But the gap is only there because of a traditional timeline that's been inherited, but not fully investigated. And that is the reason why I'm writing my first book, Dynasty of Slaves. It's a forensic deep dive into the evidence that bridges that silent gap. It's my earnest attempt to bring to bear my graduate studies in biblical history, all of the learning of my personal obsession, to answer the questions surrounding Israel's time in Egypt. I'm opening up a pre-launch sign-up right now because I want to get early feedback from you. When you join the pre-launch list at the link in the description, I'm going to send you a digital preview bundle. You'll get the current cover design for the book, the full introduction chapter, the full annotated table of contents with a lot of extra details on each future chapter, and I'm going to include one of the many visual aids that will be in the published version. This one is the recalibrated timeline that tracks every major biblical event against the actual Egyptian archaeological data. In fact, it's the chronological cheat sheet that I use for most of my talks on this YouTube channel. So, sign up at the link in the description, and let's get back to the story of the tribe that was so dangerous, Egypt tried to pretend they never existed. To understand the enslavement of the Israelites, you've first got to understand who was actually running Egypt at the time. History calls them the Hyksos, a Greek term for foreign rulers. For over 100 years, the Nile wasn't ruled by native Egyptians. It was ruled by a Semitic dynasty. The Hebrews weren't just living in Egypt during this time. They were the infrastructure. They were the administrators, the builders, and, most importantly, the military backbone. Specifically the tribe of Ephraim. The Jewish tradition actually identifies them as the royal class of the Israelites, the heirs of Joseph's viziership, who lived in the palaces while their kinsmen lived in the delta. They weren't just laborers, they were the high-ranking officers and chariot commanders of the Semitic regime. The city of Avarice was their seat of power. It's a massive, high-walled bastion in the delta that should have been able to withstand any siege. But down south in the Egyptian capital of Thebes, a native Egyptian resistance had been festering for generations. The Theban princes felt like prisoners in their own land, forced to pay tributes to the foreigners in the north. Around 1550 BC, this Cold War finally turned hot because of one of the strangest provocations in history. The Hyksos king, named Apepi, sent a messenger 500 miles south to the Theban ruler Sekenenre-Teo. The message was an insult disguised as a noise complaint. Apepi claimed that the sacred hippopotamuses in the Theban pools were so loud they were keeping him awake at night in Avarice, which was, of course, geographically impossible from 500 miles away. It was a power move. It was Apepi's way of saying, "I own you." That insult sparked a generational war. Second Enre Teo died in the battle. His mummy still shows the axe wounds from the Hyksos warriors. And his son, Kamos, continued the fight. But it was his younger son, a prince named Amos I, who finally finished the revolution. He marched north with his forces, expecting a long, bloody war against the finest chariot divisions in the ancient world. But when Amos's scouts finally reached the walls of Avaris, they found something they didn't expect. The military elite class, the tribe of Ephraim, hadn't stayed to fight. In a move that's been overlooked for centuries, the Ephraimite leadership staged a panicked, disorganized exit. They abandoned their posts and fled toward the way of the Philistines before the Egyptian blockade was even fully in place. They left in a hurry, leaving behind the very people they were supposed to protect. And this wasn't just a retreat, it was an intelligence failure, one of massive proportions. You see, the Ephraimites were obsessed with the prophecy of their return to Canaan. They had the records, and they had the promise. And as the native Egyptians advanced, the Ephraimite leadership did the math. They decided the time was up. They didn't want to wait for a miracle or a leader. They had the chariots and the weapons, and they figured they could manufacture their own exit. But they miscalculated. They timed the prophecy wrong. They were premature. When the reality of Amos's advance hit, they didn't stand and fight, they panicked. Now, there's a strange, jarring passage in the book of 1 Chronicles that confirms this. It mentions a group of Ephraimites who were killed in Gath, deep in Philistine territory, because they went down to take cattle away. If you read that as a simple livestock dispute, you're missing the scale. This is evidence of a failed, panicked breakout that happened a century before the famous Exodus. Ancient Jewish writings even record that they left in a full battle array, confident that their military power would carry them to the promised land. They thundered out of Avaris to save themselves, leaving the commoners, the craftsmen and the farmers and the families, trapped inside the walls with no protection. Now, think about the position this put Pharaoh Amos in. He's the liberator, after all, but he arrives to find that the most dangerous military force in the region has vanished into the Sinai. He isn't relieved, he's actually terrified. An enemy you can see behind a wall is an enemy you can manage. But an elite chariot army that's defected and is loose in the Levant not far away, that's a serious risk. To Amos, the Hebrews that remained weren't just neighbors. They were the logistical support for an enemy that could return at any moment to strike his border. This is why Amos didn't celebrate. He realized his border was wide open. He realized that the people still left inside the delta, the kin of those who had just fled, were now the ultimate security risk. Exodus tells us that the new Pharaoh feared the Hebrews would join with our enemies and so fight against us. Most people read that as a random bit of paranoia, but it wasn't random. It was a direct response to the Ephraimite defection. The Egyptians didn't hate the Hebrews because they were different. They feared them because their loyalty was proven to be somewhere else. When those Ephraimite leaders fled toward the sunrise, they weren't just escaping a battle. They were betraying every Hebrew left behind. They fled to save their own skin, and in doing so, they ensured that the brothers left behind would stay as slaves. But we have to ask, who gave the tribe of Ephraim the right to lead? Why were they the ones holding the tactical command of the empire's military machine while the rest of the tribes were living in the delta? Why did the Egyptian state see them as the primary threat? And why did they feel empowered to abandon the collective defense of their own people? The answers lie in their bloodline. You see, Ephraim and Manasseh weren't just the sons of Joseph. They were also the sons of Asenath, the daughter of the high priest of On. That goes far beyond a minor genealogical detail. It's a massive political statement. The priest of On was one of the most powerful religious and political figures in all of Egypt. By marriage, Joseph didn't just join an Egyptian family. He had joined the highest tier of the Egyptian aristocracy. This means that Ephraim and Manasseh were half Egyptian nobility. While the other tribes, the descendants of Reuben and Judah and Levi, for example, were shepherds, which the Bible explicitly says was an abomination to the Egyptians, the Josephites were the ultimate insiders. They didn't grow up in the shepherd camps of Goshen. They grew up in the courts of Avaris. They were educated in the temple academies. They were trained in the highest levels of Egyptian statecraft, and most importantly, they were the master class commanders in the art of chariot warfare. They were the military backbone of the Hyksos era, the technocrats and officers who kept the gears of the empire turning while the other tribes worked the land. This hybrid identity created a dangerous psychological disconnect. Because they were half Egyptian and held such high rank, the Ephraimites likely felt a different level of obligation to the rest of the Hebrew tribes. They didn't see themselves as strangers in a strange land. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Delta. They had the armor, they had the training, and they had the keys to the armory. So, when they decided that 1550 BC was the moment to break for the border, they weren't thinking about collective Israel. They weren't thinking like shepherds protecting a flock. They were thinking like an elite military class protecting its own assets and its own future. But why then? Why did they decide that 1550 BC was the specific moment to abandon their posts and head for the horizon? Well, they weren't waiting for a sign from heaven or a pillar of fire. They were looking at a stopwatch. The Ephraimites were focused on their own understanding of the 430-year prophecy, but they miscalculated the finish line. The Ephraimite leaders, being the keepers of Joseph's royal records, took this prophecy literally. They had the archives, they knew the dates, but they made a fatal, arrogant error in their interpretation of how it would end. They didn't realize that the sojourn was meant to conclude with a spiritual event, the giving of the law at Sinai. They didn't know that the Exodus was supposed to be a divine act of liberation led by a prophet. In their world, the problems were solved with bronze blades and horses. According to their calculations, the contract was over. They looked at the calendar and decided that enough time had passed. They didn't want to be around for the afflictions that had been predicted for the end of the term. They decided they were going to force the end. Far from an act of faith, this was a tactical breach fueled by panic, elitism, and a dangerous misreading of the divine clock. It serves as a stark warning for the rest of history. When we try to manufacture a prophecy we don't fully understand, we usually end up creating our own disaster. The Ephraimites bet their lives on a misreading of prophecy, and the consequences were devastating. They gathered their chariots, donned their ceremonial armor, and abandoned the defense of avarice. Imagine that scene. The finest military unit in the Delta, thundering past the mud brick homes of their cousins, leaving the farmers and the craftsmen to face the Egyptian axes alone. They figured that by the time Amos realized they were gone, they'd be safe in Canaan, reclaiming the estates of their ancestors. But prophecies aren't something you can force, and the desert has a way of punishing the arrogant. As they moved toward the Way of the Philistines, the ancient coastal highway, also called the Way of Horus, they weren't met with open arms. They were met by the men of Gath. Now, you have to understand who these men of Gath actually were. They weren't just local shepherds defending a pasture from some wandering nomads who wanted their cattle. Gath was a stronghold of Rephaim, a place of legendary warriors, giants mentioned throughout the Old Testament. These were the ancestors of Goliath. They weren't just men, they were a specialized cast of fighters, massive in stature and terrifying in their efficiency. Some historians link them to the early waves of the Sea Peoples, maritime forces that would eventually collapse the civilizations of the Late Bronze Age. These were high-tier mercenaries and warriors who had been bred for battle for centuries. The Ephraimites were elite, but they were in flight. They were disorganized, exhausted, and blinded by their own hubris. They ran headfirst into a population of warrior giants who viewed them not as returning relatives, but as invading army trying to take away their cattle. The Bible uses the phrase taking away cattle, but in the ancient world that was a military shorthand for a scorched earth raid. The Ephraimites weren't just hungry, they were trying to resupply an army on the move. They were trying to establish a military foothold in a land that had long ago forgotten the name of Joseph. And they were slaughtered. The elite military backbone of the Hebrew people, the heirs of Joseph's glory, were cut down in the sand. Their armor was stripped, their chariots were broken, and their bodies were left exactly where they fell. No burials, no monuments, just bleached bones left to rot in the sun. This is the detail that changes how we read many parts of the Bible. because those bones didn't just vanish. They became a psychological scar on the soul of the nation of Israel. The First Chronicles account, which mentions the death of Ephraim's sons Ezer and Eliad during the raid on Gath, is the key. This catastrophic loss is immediately followed by a crucial, often overlooked detail in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 22. It says, "Then Ephraim their father mourned many days, and his brothers came to comfort him. And he went in to his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Beriah, because tragedy had come upon his house." The name Beriah itself is a small detail that pierces through the centuries. It means in evil or in disaster. Ephraim's choice of the name for his newborn son is an admission of guilt or a sign of profound trauma. It's the lament of a military leader who has failed his men and caused a catastrophe for his own house. The loss was so total that the naming of his next child served not as a mark of hope, but as a permanent, painful monument to the disaster at Gath. This act of seeking new heirs was a desperate attempt to restore the bloodline that had been severed in a single arrogant military blunder. The birth of Beriah was less a celebration of life and more of a forced re-engagement with the future, an existential need to repair the damage inflicted by their own premature actions. The trauma of the dry bones in the desert was not just a national wound. It was a personal grief for Ephraim, defining the lineage of the most powerful tribe of Israel. When the real Exodus finally happens under Moses, the Bible tells us something fascinating that most people gloss over. In Exodus 13:17, it says, "God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." Now, Sunday school will tell you the people were just scared of the Philistine army, but the forensic reality is much grimmer. When the Israelites marched out with Moses, the way of the Philistines was still littered with the bleached bones of the tribe of Ephraim. The skeletons of the military elite, their brothers, their fathers, their uncles, were still laying there in the sand as a monument to what happens when you try to force God's hand. He knew that if a nation of newly freed slaves saw the skeletal remains of their most powerful warriors, the men who actually knew how to fight, they would lose all hope. They would have seen those bones and realized that even with chariots and armor, Israel had failed. But this isn't where the story of those bones ends. Centuries later, the prophet Ezekiel is taken by the Spirit and set down in the middle of a valley. And what does he see? A valley full of bones. Traditional theology says this is just a metaphor for the exile in Babylon. But if you look at it through the lens of history, Ezekiel is looking at the crime scene of Gath. He's looking at the bleached remains of the Ephraimites who abandoned their brothers and tried to force the end of their sojourn in Egypt. Now hang with me for just one more second. God asks Ezekiel if Ezekiel thinks the dry bones can live again. God's question extends past a simple metaphor. He's asking about the restoration of the very military elite that abandoned the people in Egypt. This is why, just a few verses later in Ezekiel 37, God gives a specific command about two sticks. One stick represents Judah, but the other stick is explicitly labeled as the stick of Ephraim. God commands that they be joined together into one. This transcends a simple lesson of national unity. It's the restoration of a reputation. The stick of Ephraim, the stick of the failed, fleeing military elite, is being reclaimed and joined to the heart of Israel. It's a prophecy that these dry bones, once synonymous with desertion and cowardice, will be resurrected to serve their original purpose. It's the promise that in the last days, the warrior spirit of Ephraim will no longer be used to force the end, but will be perfectly joined to Israel to defend the nation in its hour of need. But back in 1550 BC, that restoration was still a long way off. In the immediate aftermath, there was only tragedy. While the Ephraimite elite were being slaughtered in Gath, Pharaoh Amos was arriving at the gates of Avaris. He expected a siege that would last years. Instead, he found a city that had been emptied of its defenders. The expulsion of the Hyksos and the flight of Ephraim aren't two different stories. They are the same event. The Hyksos kings fled, and their military backbone, the tribe of Ephraim, fled with them, or just ahead of them. Amos walked into a city that was suddenly vulnerable. He found a population of Semitic people who were now leaderless, defenseless, and in his eyes, guilty by association. The defection of the army had created a vacuum. In a military state like the 18th dynasty, a power vacuum is never left empty. Amos didn't see the remaining Hebrews as innocent bystanders. He saw them as the families and the logistical support for the army that had just betrayed him. To him, the people left in the Delta weren't just foreigners. They were the fifth column. They were a sleeper cell waiting for the Ephraimite chariots to return from Canaan with an allied army to reclaim the Nile. When those Ephraimite leaders fled toward the sunrise, they weren't just escaping a battle. They were signing the death warrant for every Hebrew left behind. The dust from the Ephraimite chariots had barely settled before the Egyptian high command realized the scale of the crisis they were now facing. The defection of the military elite had done more than leave avarice vulnerable. It had created a catastrophic intelligence and security vacuum that dictated every move Pharaoh Amos would make next. The traditional story of the 18th dynasty usually begins with a sudden, unexplained wave of Egyptian nationalist resentment. But if you look at the military records of Amos I, specifically the inscriptions found in the tomb of his namesake, Amos, son of Abana, you'll see a campaign that was driven by cold, calculated tactical necessity rather than blind hatred. Amos I walked into avarice with a far more complex objective than mere victory. He was a military disruptor who had inherited a generational war. He was the product of a southern Egyptian resistance that had been humiliated for over a century, and by the time he marched north, his strategy moved beyond winning a battle. He aimed to dismantle the entire geopolitical structure. To understand the fall of avarice, you have to understand the geography of the Delta. In 1550 BC, the Nile was far from a simple river flowing into the sea. It was a labyrinth of marshes and canals and fortified islands. Avarice was the crown jewel of this system. It was built on a massive turtleback, a natural rise in the land that stayed dry during the flood season, and it was surrounded by water on nearly all sides. It was engineered to be untakeable. The city served as the anchor of the Hyksos defensive line. Before Amos could even target avarice, he had to secure Memphis. Memphis was the tactical choke point. By seizing the old capital first, Amos effectively severed the Delta from the rest of the Upper Egypt. He turned the Nile into a one-way street, ensuring that no reinforcements from the south could ever reach the Hyksos. This was the first phase of an encirclement that would change the face of the ancient world. Once Memphis was secured, Amos moved his headquarters directly to the front lines. He recognized that a standard infantry assault of the Delta would be a suicide. The Hyksos and their Ephraimite military backbone were the undisputed masters of the chariot. In the open plains of the north, they could shred an Egyptian infantry line before it even reached the city gates. To counter this, Amos weaponized the Nile itself. He commissioned a fleet of war galleys and used them to turn the river into a logistical highway for his troops. This allowed him to bypass the heavily fortified land routes and strike directly at the heart of the Delta. His goal was total operational isolation, creating a state where nothing could go in or out of the city. This is where the military narrative takes a sharp turn. Egyptian records, particularly the autobiography of Amos, son of Abana, tell us that the pharaoh fought a series of naval engagements on the Water of Avarice, the specific canal system surrounding the city. He wasn't simply fighting for territory, he was fighting for the arteries of the city. He was systematically cutting the Hyksos off from their supply lines, strangling the capital in a state of total isolation. But while he was tightening the noose on the city's waterborne gates, a massive failure occurred in the intelligence department. While Amos was focusing on the front door of the Delta, the back door, the ancient highway leading into the Sinai, was left unguarded. This was the opening the tribe of Ephraim had been waiting for. They realized that Amos was preparing for a long, grueling siege, but he wasn't yet prepared for a mass, high-speed defection. When the Ephraimite military elite thundered out of the city and toward the way of the Philistines, they were doing more than escaping a siege. They were exploiting a critical hole in Amos's tactical line. His strategy shifted instantly from conquest to containment. He realized that the way of the Philistines, the very road the Ephraimites used to escape, was a two-way street. If an army could leak out, a larger coalition army could march back in. To Amos, every Hebrew left behind in the Delta was no longer just a resident. They were the logistical tail of an enemy force that was now loose in the Levant. Amos's response was a masterclass in border security. His first priority was to seize Charu, the massive frontier fortress that stood as the gateway between Egypt and Canaan. Charu was the strategic headquarters, the lock on the Egyptian side of the door. He could monitor the entire eastern frontier and coordinate the final phase of his campaign. Next, Amos turned his attention back to the people left in the Delta. He had a massive population of Semitic people who were technically guilty by association with the old regime. He couldn't kill them all, that would be an economic disaster, but he could never trust them with a weapon again. So, he redefined their purpose. The Hebrews in the Delta were no longer the protective administrative class of the previous regime. They were the labor force that would rebuild the Egypt that had been shattered by the war. Amos realized that if they were busy moving massive stones to build his monuments, they wouldn't have the hands to hold weapons. This is a potentially dark reality of Exodus chapter 1 verse 8. The king who did not know Joseph did more than just forget a name. He systematically dismantled the entire Josephite infrastructure. He saw a population that was once the backbone of the empire and redefined them as a fifth column, a hidden enemy that had to be neutralized through backbreaking stationary labor. The enslavement served as a military-grade security protocol rather than a sudden burst of cruelty. It was the only way the 18th dynasty felt they could guarantee that a security breach like the Ephraimite flight would never happen again. When we see the Israelites crying out under the burden of their taskmasters, we have to remember those thundering wheels on the morning of the defection. The tragedy of the expulsion is that the flight of the few ensured the chains of the many. Let's put this all together. The Ephraimite warriors are dead in the sand at Gath. The elite are gone, and back in Egypt, the new king who did not know Joseph, his name is Pharaoh Amos, is looking at the map. He's just finished a war of liberation. From his perspective, he's driven out the foreign Hyksos out of avarice. But he has a massive internal problem. He has an entire population of Hebrews sitting in the Delta who were the logistical tail for the very people he had just expelled. This is where the narrative shifts from military history to national security. Exodus tells us that Pharaoh was afraid. He says, if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. But notice the solution. He doesn't execute them. He sets taskmasters over them. In Egyptian military terms, this was a security protocol. It was about immobilization. Amos was stuck in a strategic trap. He couldn't afford to lose the Hebrew workforce. The Egyptian economy would have collapsed overnight. But he couldn't leave them free. A free population in the Delta was a fifth column just waiting for the signal from the defectors in the desert. And we have to remember, Pharaoh didn't have a live satellite feed. He didn't know his enemies were already dead in the sand at Gath. All he saw was a highly trained, heavily armed military force that had vanished into the eastern wilderness. To Amos, they weren't gone. They were a ghost army, a threat that could reappear on his border at any moment to reclaim their status. So his solution wasn't a prison cell. It was the mud pit. If you want to ensure an internal threat never has the time or the energy to revolt, you put them to work. Now, the Bible tells us they built store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. Chronologically, we know those names come much later. In 1550 BC, these sites were known as Per Adam and Avaris, but the biblical authors used the names their audience would recognize in later years. The massive supply hubs that would eventually sit right on top of the old 18th dynasty ruins. And these weren't just warehouses. In the 18th dynasty, these were supply depots for the Egyptian military. Pharaoh forced the Hebrews to build the very infrastructure that would be used to prevent their own brothers from ever coming back. The men who once managed the granaries of Joseph were now forced to crawl into the mud to make the bricks for Pharaoh's war machine. The kings of the Delta had been replaced by a dynasty of slaves. And the worst part, the gates were shut. The desert was a graveyard, and there was no one left to lead them, or so Pharaoh thought. If you think this is just a convenient story, you need to look at the ground. Modern archaeology at the site of Avaris reveals a city that didn't just disappear. It was fundamentally repurposed. The excavations of that site show a dramatic shift in the strata. High-status Asiatic villas with gardens and personal tombs were suddenly flattened and replaced with military barracks and industrial workshops. This is the physical receipt, if you will, of the 18th dynasty takeover. We see the exact moment an elite immigrant class was stripped of its status and reduced to a state-controlled workforce. Ancient historians like Manetho, writing centuries later, preserve the memory of this expulsion. But his records often blurred the lines between the Hyksos kings, who were driven out, and the Hebrew population that was left behind. He describes a group of polluted people who were segregated and forced into the stone quarries, a distorted echo of the historical transition from the foreign Hyksos rulers to the enslaved Israelites. When you align these ancient accounts with the military journals of Amos, son of Abana, the picture becomes clear. The 18th dynasty didn't just win a war. They identified a lingering military threat, and they neutralized it through systematic dehumanization. But Pharaoh's protocol had a critical blind spot. While the 18th dynasty was liquidating the status of the Hebrews in the Delta to ensure those who had already defected could never find a foothold upon their return, they were simultaneously absorbing a different class of Hebrews into the domestic administration. This was the House of Levi. We know this because the Levites carried a linguistic tag that separates them from the rest of the tribes. Their names, like Phineas and Merari, are not Hebrew names. They're high-status Egyptian titles. This indicates that the Levites had successfully assimilated into the Egyptian priestly and domestic infrastructure. Even the name Moses has an Egyptian piece to it. This service class status provided the House of Levi with a unique kind of security clearance. Take Aaron, for example. We're often told he was just a spokesman, but in the 18th dynasty, his role was likely far more complex. He didn't just speak well, he spoke the high register Egyptian of the court. He knew the protocols, the etiquette, and the ritual heka of the priesthood. Aaron was able to move freely enough to meet Moses in the wilderness in Exodus 4. He was the administrator who remained, it says, the intelligence officer on the ground who knew how to navigate the very system that was crushing his brothers. This is the setting for the birth of Moses even. The Nile Delta has become a high-security labor camp. The warriors are dead, the politicians have defected, the Egyptian military has established a cork in the bottle at the border. Israel is stuck. It would take a miracle for them to see freedom at this point. On paper, the Hebrew story should have ended right here in the mud of avarice. But while Pharaoh was focused on perfecting his security protocol and fortifying the border, a quiet rebellion was beginning in the House of Levi. A rebellion led by men who had mastered the language of the palace to prepare for the day they would lead their people out of it.